session here. McGurl. I am Executive Director of the Bibliographical Society of America, and I'm just delighted to welcome such a big group to Building Better Book Feminisms. So I also want to start by thanking our co-sponsor, Cornell University Library. Without them, we would not have been able to have such a large group today. So thank you to Tamar and to Cornell and to Meredith Collins for facilitating all of this and making it possible to welcome just so many people today. It's really so great. So I just put a link in the chat to the Spanish translation option for closed captioning. We do have live closed captioning today. And if you want to see those captions translated in Spanish, they're quite accurate. Please just click that link and select Spanish from the drop-down menu. I'm also about to share links to our code of conduct and upcoming BSA programs. BSA programs are free and open to everyone, and we would love to have any of you join us for some future events. A couple of other housekeeping notes before we get started. If you are going to pose a question to this group when it is time to do so, please use the Q&A button to do that. You can type your questions in as they come up as we're going along. So I'll urge you to do that and keep an eye on the questions that your fellow participants are asking. It's really nice to be able to upvote those questions. And okay, Jean Marie, I'll fix that link in a second. It's really nice to upvote those questions, help us see which ones are of greatest interest to the group. If you'd like to sort of comment on the proceedings today, you can use the chat for that, and we love a robust conversation. If anyone is tweeting about the event, you can use the hashtag BSA FemBib. I'll put that in the chat as well in a second. And oh, thanks, Kate. And I believe that is all. I will hand things over now to our first presenter, Leslie Howsam. I'm going to ask everyone to introduce themselves when they start presenting. That way we don't do introductions all at the beginning. And so take it away, Leslie. Thanks.
Thank you, Erin, very much. I'm Leslie Howsam. I am a retired professor of history, but still an active researcher. And I was president of SHARP for a while, so many people will know me through that society. I want to start by thanking you, Erin, and the BSA and Cornell University Library for making this happen. I'm in Toronto this afternoon, and I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. And perhaps that spirit is a good place to start thinking about feminisms and books in 2020, at almost the end of this extraordinary year. The themes I'm going to evoke are that feminist books studies are capacious, ambitious, generous, and collaborative, which is also to say that they're the opposite of narrow, hierarchical, judgmental, and heroic. Can we go to the next slide, please? The reason I'm here is not because my scholarship has been focused on women's contributions to authorship, publishing, reading, and the material book, although my research always includes women. The reason I'm here is that over 20 years ago, in 1998, I was asked to write an opinion piece about women in book history. It was for Sharp News, the newsletter of the Society for the History of Authorship, Reading, and Publishing. That particular issue of Sharp News was celebrating research on women's book history, and there was already a lot of it going on. I'm not going to drop names here because you can find them in the Women's Book History Bibliography, which I put on the slide, and we can hear more about from Kate. In the late 90s, feminist history was pretty much established with academic appointments, conferences, journals, and so forth. Same for feminist literary studies, anthropology, economics, and other disciplines. So what I asked myself was, what would a feminist bibliography look like? What if we thought about how the book, the material object, has been gendered? So I started thinking a bit about published writing versus private writing, public versus private, and about making versus using, and about book collectors. And you know them, their passion for the first edition and all that sort of thing. All of which I wrote about, but at the same time I was beginning to wonder, why is it that book history, which is flourishing all around me, exciting sharp conferences, brisk debates between book historians and bibliographers, arguments between theory-oriented scholars and strict empiricists, all that, why is our field of study taking so long to come to terms with gender? And I wondered that for quite a while. So I was delighted to see both Sarah's and Kate's articles coming out in 2018, a full 20 years after mine. And even more delighted to see the gender conversation about books being conducted in the context of indigeneity and Blackness and queerness and class and migration. So here's my answer to what feminist theory offers to the study of the material text, which is what Erin asked us. I think it offers the opportunity to rescue and to repurpose the rigorous methods and the deep knowledge associated with that interdisciplinary field of study, to frame it as something central to humanities research, because it's designed to disclose the evidence of human labor and care. Can we have the next slide down? But even while I celebrate feminist book history's capaciousness, its ambition, its generosity, and its collaboration, I want to quickly sketch in some concerns and caveats. Capacious in that we ask big, far-reaching questions that can't always be answered either by the direct evidence of the archive or of the book at hand. But that means it is open to the critique of lowering standards of evidence or trying to be all things to all people. Ambitious in the sense that its practitioners know that our work has that central place in the humanities, a transnational, intersectional history of the book that is solidly based in material bibliography, not exclusively based there, but not peripheral in any sense. But an ambitious approach might be viewed as overzealous, although fortunately that can be tempered by being aware of your own resource limitations, as well as being aware of your subject position and inevitable bias. Generous, in the sense that it reconstitutes the judgmental aspect that is one of the pillars of textual and bibliographical scholarship, and you all know what I mean by that, reconstitutes that judgmental aspect as a practice of criticism that is rigorous and honest, but please, never dismissive, even in profound disagreement about methods or conclusions. And finally, collaborative in that it is inherently interdisciplinary. Feminist bibliographers are more likely to work with scholars of disciplines other than the one in which their own training is grounded. And the caveat there, everyone knows, is that collaboration is always hard work and takes real time. Thanks very much.
Up next, we have Kate Ozment, and I'm starting her slideshow now. So take it away, Kate.
Thank you, Erin. The title of my talk today, which I did not put on the slide for some reason, is Can Citation Be Feminist? And I think it's telling that when I try to put into words what is feminist bibliography or book feminism, I find intense internal resistance. I'm able to articulate definitions of different kinds of bibliographies and studies of material books. And if you ask me what my feminist philosophy is, I can drop you my top 10 favorite books from a variety of years at a moment's notice. But every time I try to define this intersection, it feels flat and it feels like it lacks nuance. Some parts of me find the regulated and empirical nature of bibliography at odds with feminist inquiry. And this is where I start to see the cracks in my own work as I attempt to marry these two disciplines. To keep myself from getting too abstract, I will focus on one kind of bibliography that connects the disparate fields of book studies, the citation. Enumerative bibliography, or structuring citations and making lists around a particular subject or purpose, is the most popular kind of bibliography. It's the only one that everybody here is familiar with. Sarah Ahmed writes that citations are feminist memory, and movements like Citasista emphasize the importance of citation in legitimizing Black women's contributions to academia. These are important mandates that I try to live up to in my work. But I want to focus on the mechanics of the citation itself, the empirical, regulated format that makes it so hard for me to blend it with feminism when I think about not only how citations are used, but how they operate to legitimize labor. A citation organizes data into a linear hierarchy that is designed to point a reader to an artifact where they can access the information that has been replicated in the document they're looking at. Citations are defined by 20th century print-focused norms that emphasize brevity and consistency. In choosing what to include and what to leave out, the citation has a regulated hierarchy that focuses on only some kinds of human labor and ownership: the author and the publisher, and sometimes the repository. For all objects, information is left out, and this is increasingly troublesome for those of us who work with archives and special collections. For archival materials, citations tend to focus on each object as unique, as we cite the archive and usually the shelf mark or other identifying information. But this additional detail is still the same kind of ownership. To trace the cracks I've noticed, let's look at an example from Roswitha Club. My German is terrible, I apologize in advance. Roswitha Club is a women's book collectors club that operated between 1994 and 2004 in the Northeastern United States. And you're looking at an artifact from that club's archive here. Here is a sample of some meeting minutes. Minutes were published in a coterie. A secretary took notes of meetings that were then typed up and checked by club members and then circulated. This one in particular, I could have picked any of them, details books presented to the Roswitha Club Library from members like Ruth Granis, Henrietta Bartlett, and Anne Haight. Here are two examples, Aaron, slide please. Here are two examples of how journals have asked me to cite these materials. In both, information is missing. Of course, that's how citations function. And for some of these observations, I am very grateful to Molly Hardy and everybody who tweets at me all the time about citations. You're in my head constantly. The finding aid is excluded, first of all. The finding aid also doesn't have a name on it, and it doesn't list who cataloged this collection. And these are names that I'm trying to find before I publish this work, which is one of the main reasons that I haven't published it yet. This citation also doesn't list the librarians who continue to maintain this collection or have maintained it in years past. I do have some of these names from club records. The citation doesn't represent who owned this binder and carefully tucked in each month's contribution over the decades. It doesn't represent any book dealers or people in the trades who worked with or around these materials. Then when we expand even beyond this, we see how much labor and acknowledgement has been left out of this citational practice. There's the archive, the Grolier Club, which houses the collection. It sits on colonized land taken from the Lenni Lenape tribe. And then there's me, the scholar who sits on Gabrielino and Tongva land in my home and my work. There's the context of each person cited in this document, whose identities I have spent a year tracking down along with intrepid research assistant Kelly Wong, and their lives and their domestic labor that they performed and benefited from, just as one example of the many different paths that a citation could acknowledge and could look at. So citing more of this labor is a feminist act for me. It is acknowledging the colonial and institutional context in which I move and work, and citing essential and valuable scholarship, much of which is done by women due to the historical makeup of librarianship and cataloging. Yet the format of the citation does not let me cite, according to the feminist philosophy that I read and value. I'm left to disembodied footnotes and acknowledgements, which are its own form and challenge. I could imagine how to fit more information in, but it wouldn't be regulated or brief. And to change the system of citational practices would require updating expensive infrastructure across multiple disciplines. And of course, there is a basis for more extensive citation with MARC records and cataloging, but I don't think only cataloging records deserve that kind of deep research, but it would be an investment of resources. So this proposed or theoretical feminist citation practice would be expansive and it would be messy and it would be hard, but I think it might be more just. And I'm not suggesting that we throw a citation out the window. It's too important as a mechanism for legitimizing the work of scholars and disciplines on the margins. I am suggesting that we characterize citational mechanics as patriarchal in our discussions of book feminisms. As with the Dewey Decimal System, citations are not simple reference formats, but they serve as a regulatory influence for what labor is and is not valuable. Erin, slide please. They can be a tool of patriarchy or feminism, white supremacy or anti-racism. As Adrienne Rich says, this is the oppressor's language, yet I need it to talk to you. In their exclusion of so many kinds of labor and acknowledgement, citations are the mechanisms of patriarchy, and yet I need them to talk to you. So I'm curious, how could we change that language? Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. Up next, we have Tamar Evangelistia-Dougherty, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm Tamar Doherty. I'm the Associate University Librarian for Rare and Distinctive Collections here at Cornell. I wanted to thank the BSA, and I'm so honored to be a part of this panel. I think this panel is really timely given the current state of social unrest in the United States. We're in a pandemic, we're experiencing the Me Too movement and also the Black Lives Matter movement. I want to say in all transparency that for Black women in particular, feminism in all its waves has been historically fraught for us and not always places of inclusion. We must acknowledge that. Many Black women who are feminists have been oppressed and marginalized by white feminists. Recently, during an academic panel, someone mentioned that whenever there is a panel of feminists, there's usually only one woman of color present. So we have to juxtapose Black feminism with white feminism and uncouple this and what it means. And I think we can all agree that Black and white feminists alike are seeking peace, justice, and strength through our work. More poignantly today, I think we're all seeking power through the book culture that we love. So I'm just going to quickly survey Black feminist librarians who've inspired my work and led me to interrogate traditions of print culture as it relates to libraries as gendered spaces. I also have a hyper awareness about their representation in feminist bibliographies through collective memory. Looking at this first slide, I want to give a hat tip to Kate, who I was so just enthralled in reading her piece because I want to thank her so much for including librarians in this space. And she mentions that many women were curators like Mortimer, catalogers, indexers, archivists, and librarians. They did bibliography, but often were not identified as bibliographers professionally. My search thus became a search for women's bibliographic labor. Next slide, please. And another great quote, most women's bibliographic labor is found in libraries. As a feminized profession, librarianship has been historically undervalued since its formal creation in the mid-19th century. And I think we can all say that women in librarianship are trying to be successful and doing the best we can to elevate our histories despite what Melville Dewey had in mind for us in this profession. Next slide, please. As I said, I'm very interested in print culture, and I just wanted to give a shout out to another woman who's inspired me, Jackie Orms, who was the first professional Black woman cartoonist in the US. And this is a part of print culture, and she worked for the Chicago Defender, among other African-American newspapers, and was also in the trenches being a feminist and fighting against patriarchy. Next slide, please. Also, an influence for me was Spare Rib magazine, the radical feminist magazine from the UK that I'm so proud that I have a whole run and used to inform a lot of my work in being a curator. Next slide, please. So I decided to kind of entitle this book History's Extra Rib, and kind of playing on that idea of Adam and Eve and us getting the spare rib from Adam, and how does Black librarianship play into that? And the women that I think influenced me most are Bella DaCosta Green, Vivian Harsh, Dorothy Porter Wesley, Jean Blackwell Hudson, and that should say Mamie Agnew Clayton. Next slide, please. Jean Blackwell Hudson was someone who some people have said kind of worked in the shadow of Arturo Schomburg, but I don't think so at all. The JBH division in the Schomburg, which is the General Reference Division, is actually named for her. And she was doing that labor that Kate was talking about and increased their volumes from 12,000 to 75,000. And also collected primarily in Haitian materials, and had very influential friends in her life who brought collections to the Schomburg, such as Langston Hughes. Next slide, please. Vivian Harsh from my hometown, Chicago, Illinois, also a Simmons graduate as myself, first started working at the Hall branch and was the first Black librarian in Chicago Public Library. And it is also rumored that she was possibly the first Black library student at Simmons College. Next slide, please. Dorothy Porter Wesley, who graduated from Columbia with an MLS degree and was a powerhouse, and her bibliographies just reflected her subject expertise at Howard University. Next slide, please.
Tamar, you're at 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. And the last one is next slide, actually. Mamie Agnew Clayton, who was a librarian at USC and UCLA and independently founded the Mamie Clayton Library and Museum located in Culver City. So just to wrap up, I'm very interested in the legacy of these women and how they affect the canon of feminist bibliography. Thank you.
All right, I'm just going to scroll through your slides to get to the end, and then everyone can see these really great images that you have here. This is the very last one. And now we have Brenda Marston up next.
Hi, I'm Brenda Marston. I'm curator of the Human Sexuality Collection here at Cornell, and I use she, her pronouns. When we decided to share our own definition of feminism, a simple answer popped in my head. Leslie Gore's "You Don't Own Me." Don't tell me what to do. Don't tell me what to say. Pretty much sums it up. Then one of my favorite jokes came to mind. How many feminists does it take to screw in a light bulb? One, and that's not funny. When feminists are really the funniest people I know, why does this humorless stereotype exist? Because feminists take certain things seriously that others don't. Let me tell you what I take seriously. The destructive power of societal norms around what behaviors and limitations should be linked to people based on some of their body parts. I'm interested in the ways that people's experience of their bodies and sexual pleasure are tied to culture. I have intellectual curiosity around people who choose to support or to resist gender and sexual norms. I pay attention to how societies dole out rewards and punishments along these lines. I have empathy for those that don't fit the norms and respect for the ways they find to lead their lives. Almost 40 years ago, I jumped at the chance to go to the first graduate program in women's history. Back then, we already had a clear idea that women's history is about more than finding and elevating women who managed to break barriers and do things that make men famous. Women's history joined the fields of social history, labor history, and Black history, all in proclaiming the telling of history has been limited. We think things that have been overlooked are in fact important, and we want to explore them. We have different questions we want to ask and answer. How does this background affect my work as a curator and ideas about better book feminisms? Next slide, please. I'm here expressly to make new research possible. So this makes me happy. A student telling classmates what he found in the human sexuality collection, a hand crank vibrator. You can do new research on existing sources. Hamilton comes to mind as a successful example, but you can't do research on things that aren't in the archives. I'm focused on making room in the vault for things that have been excluded in the past. Next slide. Students in a History of Love course next semester will get to consider radical feminist T. Grace Atkinson speaking about vaginal orgasm the day after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. You see here she begins, I suppose we all have put aside the speeches we prepared before last night. In the face of Martin King's death, one must tell the truth as plain as one can. Next slide. Students will also find documents from the League for Sexual Freedom, which came from an ideologically different perspective, promoting the legalization of prostitution. Next slide. With my feminist lens, it is a riotous joy for me to make the whole catalog of Gender Fail Press available in our library. Here's a page from Bodyworks that reads, it's no wonder that there are clashes between Bell Hooks and Beyonce, or more accurately, Janet Mock on behalf of Beyonce, or for women to be threatened by Alicia Keys' choice to stop wearing makeup. Next. Among the most valuable collections I've acquired are those of photographers, writers, and other visionaries who broke ground in portraying sexual subcultures and women's erotic desire. To do so, they overcame practical barriers, including printers not willing to accept their work. The original proofs of the 1978 I Am My Lover by Joni Blank, Honey Lee Cottrell, and T. Corinne were lost to history because the printers in Mexico who agreed to and did print the work did not return the proofs. This is printing history that strikes me as important. Next slide. Being motivated by curiosity about all of these ideas, I think has made me deeply empathetic and interested in understanding others whose paths have been different than my own. I may approach donors because of my own interests, but I always listen deeply to what matters to them. I learned about the printing history of I Am My Lover from the donor. Through my experience with gay and bisexual men losing their lives due to AIDS in the 1980s and 90s, I witnessed their determination to leave a permanent trace of themselves in an archives. The journals they donated were uniquely their own, but a prevalent thread through them was the intentionality and urgency of what they had to communicate. In the papers of Robert Lynch, pictured here in the center, he made sure to document the people and art of his home in Eastern North Carolina. Next slide. When I saw this in Robert Lynch's diary, I felt sure that he saved this warning sign that had been hanging on his hospital room door to document something significant. It makes me feel his sense of isolation. I've shown this hot pink laminated hospital sign to countless students, many of whom were pre-med, and were also moved by what it meant that he brought it home and pasted it into his diary. This is the kind of impact that I care about making and the kind of life story that I think is so important to elevate and preserve. Next slide. Lastly, being a feminist makes me wildly charmed by the wit, insight, and provocative thoughts of the other panelists with me here today. Glad to be here. Thanks.
Thank you, Brenda. Up next is Sarah Werner, and I will stop sharing my screen so she can go ahead.
Thanks. I have no slides for you, but just some thoughts I bring to you as somebody who has written a book called Studying Early Printed Books, 1450 to 1800, a practical guide, and who spent about a decade a while back at the Folger teaching undergraduates. how to use books. So the perspective I bring to feminist book practices is that of someone who has spent a long time teaching students how to think about early printed books as material objects, a practice that attuned me to the weirdness of these artifacts for modern users and to the constructedness of their existence in collections today. It's not new, of course, to think about printed books as material artifacts. There's a long, There's a long distinguished tradition of this in Anglo-American bibliography, starting at least in the mid-19th century with Henry Bradshaw's methodical examination of incunables. Bradshaw helped usher in the modern era of bibliography, one that from its earliest years strove to develop a scientific approach to the study of books that would differentiate it from amateur bibliomania and help place it at the center of textual studies. It's no surprise, really, that the subsequent work of Pollard, Gregg, Bowers, and others prioritized the first centuries of printing over other types of textual objects. While early print is a lot messier than we sometimes give credit to it, the hand press period is also certainly neater than the output of the machine and now digital press eras. But even in that near tidy era of print, bibliographers focused on the replicable to the exclusion of vast swaths of textual material, preferring works that existed in multiple copies and states and editions to those that are unique. Manuscripts were not part of the field study, to the detriment of how generations of scholars understand the transmissions of text, nor were inserted plates recorded as part of the book in bibliographic descriptions, even when they were a key part of that book's meaning. Vowels, those miracles of paper computing that were central to the printed book's role in disseminating mathematical and astronomical knowledge. Vowels remained outside of bibliographic focus until only very recent attempts to provide a formula for describing them and more expensive attention to their practice in their production practices. Bibliography is dependent on the notion of an ideal copy and a typical practice in order to perform the sort of analytical work necessary to its sense of itself as a serious study. And it has prioritized objects that allow it to stay focused on the ideal and typical, erasing the full spectrum of artifacts and the histories of those artifacts once they enter readers' lives. And because what bibliographers study is what bibliographers want, those desires for discrete textual objects led to private and library collections of early printed books that separated samelbands into individual codices, splitting books once comprised of printed and manuscript texts into different collections. Those desires created collections that prioritized first editions and canonical works of history, literature, religion, and science. Those desires helped build a scale for book dealers to rate book conditions from fine and very good all the way down to working copy. So what does feminist bibliography do for this world? One answer is that it opens up what categories of textual objects we study and what types of questions we ask of material artifacts. A feminist approach to bibliography might look at the not collected, at the left behind, at the messy, imperfect, unfinished, user-shaped copy. Or equally, it might look at the same stable artifacts and ask questions about the ways in which they might be unfinished or remade by users, or why they were desired as part of a collection. Feminist bibliography might place value on the idiosyncratic or unknown uses and creations of books, rather than on creating systems for analyzing patterns of book printing. In other words, it could be a bibliographical practice that puts users at the center of an open-ended system of making textual meanings and considers the ways in which physical incarnations are manifested at different stages of an artifact's life. Another question feminist bibliography might raise is what counts as scholarship? Articles and books, of course, but what about lectures streamed on video? Lectures invited and delivered but unrecorded? Syllabi and seminar reading lists? Catalogs and finding aids? Do these appear in our lists of feminist book work? Why not? If a single fragment of the only known extant copy of a poem that you need special permission to view is worthy of bibliography, why would a 45-minute lecture preserved on YouTube not be part of the feminist scholarly canon? I want my book Feminisms to focus on textual objects of all periods created by all methods of textual transmission. I want it to counter the long history of white male authorship and white male printing and white male scholarship that has never reflected the world as it is. And I want it to invite into our field fresh eyes and new quests to empower insightful and generative questions over the mastery and recall of minute details. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. So I will invite all of our panelists today to turn their video on for our discussion. I have a couple of questions to get us started, but I do encourage you to, in addition to cheering inside your house, that's wonderful, to please pop some questions into the Q&A once you've caught your breath. So the first question is, what do we mean by books and what do we mean by feminisms?
We're all dead silent, but going, no, those are too big to wrestle with.
I mean, I'll start because this is a really hard question. And when we asked this of each other in our prep session, we made those same faces. So I think I talked about my internal resistance, that's what's popping up. But for me, I'm a literature PhD, which I didn't say, and that definitely informs the way that I came to book history. But my feminism is primarily couched in intersectional feminism, which is a theory I teach in literary theory and is a challenge for me as a white woman to try to not do white feminism, even though I am maybe a white feminist. So for my feminism, if it is constantly self-reflective, it is, to borrow words from Joanna Russ, to constantly, through an active revision, place yourself in a situation that is not your own, and understanding that if you help the most marginalized of our communities, you help us all. So that's my feminism. Anybody else? Brenda already did hers, which was lovely.
It was. I've been taking a lot of thoughts about what my feminism is and how do you practice it from Sarah Ahmed, who I think, Kate, you also cited in your paper. And Ahmed's notion of part of what feminism is about centering a sort of like female powered experience, but that part of its living in your life is the constant bumping up against people who tell you that isn't how life is. And that you are constantly having to reassert your own experience and your right to your own experience. And that if you're doing that, it also opens you up to seeing other people's experiences is valid in that. So for me, it's been really helpful as a way out of that sort of blinkered white tradition that I grew up in. And books, you know what? I mean, I just gave a definition. I use book as a word all the time because there isn't a better shorthand for textual objects, and textual objects is a horrible phrase. Like, it's really hard to say and it's really vague. But I don't think that when we're talking about better book feminisms that we should only be talking about codices, like printed books that you hold in your hands. I think it's everything from posters to things that are online to old manuscripts to, I think if it records words, it's valid. I'm only pausing because now I'm worried about audio recordings, but somebody else can deal with that.
Tamar and Brenda, Tamar, can you just confirm that you can talk even if you can't get your video back on?
I can talk.
Okay, great. Well, as someone who works with 20th century materials,
It says you disabled my video, so that's why I can't.
Oh, no. Okay. Well, Meredith, as the host, can you make sure you turn on Tamar's video again? Okay, great. Here she is.
Maybe Leslie's.
Maybe
And
Leslie.
Leslie's also. Yes, thank you. So I was wondering if, as someone who gave some examples of 20th century materials at the very beginning of your talk, what do you think of as how we define book, and of course also feminisms too?
Well, because I collect artist books, which often is challenged as whether they're books or not, I have a very, I think, just wide view of what books are. To me, they can take many shapes and many forms, and as long as they incite my curiosity. And I am stodgy about one thing, that there does have to be some kind of text sometimes, but to me, that's what a book is. But when joining this panel, and I think, when we were talking about this during the practice run, the idea of bibliographies, and what does that mean? And I was really glad to see that Leslie was embracing of manuscripts and archives as part of something that informs that work. And hence you saw that at the beginning of my talk, Jackie Orms, the cartoonist, which is not really working with the book, but I think she inspired so many women, and including, she was around the same time as Vivian Harsh. And there was such a very strong feminist bibliography belt in Chicago that no one often talks about, and how also that impacted the men that were in those spaces of the library. So I don't know if I answered your question on that, but really I am embracing of many different definitions of the book. As feminism, as I said, being of color, that has represented many different things to me. I do consider myself a feminist, but I also acknowledge that I am BIPOC. And that means something else in that space as well.
I will add that even though I defined feminism, that obviously my definition of book is very broad. To me, it includes vibrators, hospital door signs, and diaries. So I think I use more the notion of a primary source, the sources that tell us something about history.
Perhaps I could comment on how we just talk about books by invoking an article that was in, I think, the second issue of the journal Book History by my Toronto colleague, Germaine Workington. And Germaine was faced with the question, where does the history of the book in Canada start? And she thought it was a pretty lame answer to say when some American brought loyalists brought the first printing press. And she also wasn't satisfied with the answer that books as such were imported from Europe. She started to think about First Nations cultures as book cultures, and to think about the textuality, if you like, of things like wampum and other kinds of materials. So for me, that really opened up. I've never been able to think of anything without thinking about that definition. But I think also as we have to face the fact that most people, when they think about a book, think about a book-shaped object, a codex, and that's part of why they get so excited about, is the digital a book, and is the book dead, and all that sort of stuff, because they're so focused on the object rather than a kind of a concept of a book as something that is more of an idea than anything else. A book is something that's mutable, it's something that's mobile, something that people have to do with. Those are the kinds of ways to start thinking about it, I think.
I will. So I'm anticipating in part of sort of the way our conversation went when we had it in version, and I'm realizing, listening to our definitions of books, that despite what I sort of said in my own, where I started going for like, woo, everything's a book, it turns out actually, no, everything's not a book for me. I really do have boundaries around that. And for me, that boundary is, I saw Tamar shaking her head or nodding her head too. When Brenda said vibrators, I was like, nope, not for me. Absolutely, they are important historical objects and cultural artifacts, and they should be collected and studied and preserved, and they are not books.
But what about, I'm going to push back here, because what if there is a printed plate for an early one, let's say, that is textual and brand the vibrator as, you know, made by so-and-so, or, you know, if we're looking at a 20th or 21st century vibrator, what if there's printed branding on it?
And there are. I mean, we know this, right? Let's just admit it. There are printed labels on all of those. Or am it's not a book. Maybe it's ratio. I mean, for me, it's sort of like, I probably should spend more time with this question. Like, maybe the thing that differentiates when that manufacturer's label on an object switches it from being, you know, historical object that we study to text, maybe it has to do with like the percentage of volume that is taking up, because I'm thinking about it as a 3D object, or like, I'm not entirely sure. I can see that there's going to be a gray area in which I'm going to be like, oh, I don't know if that's
Okay, Sarah.
Yeah.
Question. This is a book. I collect feminist artist books. It's not
yeah. Totally with you.
Silverberg.
Yeah.
Which describes the wife is a wife because of her hands, and it's from South Africa. Do you consider that a book?
Yeah. It's a textual object. So I do use the word book, but I'm not limited to the material shape of the book. So like that's a textual artifact that's no more unique than a manuscript is, right? Like, this is the thing about artist books oftentimes, is they're one-offs, but a manuscript is a one-off. So therefore,
well, I'd like to
textual object worthy of study.
With a couple of really good observations and comments from the chat here. One is from Jesse Randall, and they say a book is a continuum, not an either or, which I think is a really useful concept. And I think that the word book starts to really become something that we trip over when we're thinking about bibliography and material textual culture, because also, as Megan Pizer points out, there aren't printed words on wampum, and yet wampum are used to communicate very, very specific messages using a different type of visual language. So I think we could probably, I also want to point out something that Elizabeth Ott said. She's reminded of Jesse Erickson's work on something it's coming fast and furious, so it moved. Jesse Erickson's work on ethnobibliography and the non-textual places that text exists, such as tattoos. So I think that the idea, going back to what Jesse Randall said, that a book is a continuum, not an either or, is maybe a place we can settle. And also maybe we need to think about using a different word besides books to describe the kinds of textual, a greater material textual culture. And I realize bibliography, with the root of bib, meaning book, further complicates that issue. But I want to also move on to a couple of the great questions that we have here. The first one, I'm going to start with this question from Molly Schwartzberg. The title of the session says we need to build better book feminisms. What do we need to do practically to make that happen, and who are we?
I feel like I should take a first stab at that, since I was the one who called this session Better Book Feminisms. The easier part is the we. I think that the we is anyone who has an investment in any aspect of books, reading, writing, publishing, regardless of what form they're in, regardless if we are faculty or librarians or book dealers or none of the above, and we're just people who like to read. I do think it's a collective responsibility. It's not something that any one of us can carry by ourselves. I don't think that anyone on this panel thinks that we somehow have the answer to what book feminism is. And one of the hopes that we really wanted to get out of this conversation was to, in fact, explode the possibility of there being a single answer to what book feminisms are, that there's lots of different approaches. And my focus on early printed books means that I tend to see things from one angle. And so I need to talk with other people. Concrete steps to make it better, I think it's a combination of we need to convince ourselves and the people who are not ourselves that this is a way that we work, and this is a way that we think, and this is not a way that's going to go away, right? So you can't just say, oh no, I'm sorry, we're not interested in funding that, we're not going to study that. That's not really a real thing. It is a real thing. And I think we'll know that we succeeded when it's just everywhere around us. I'm sorry, that's not really giving me a concrete thing. I don't work at an institution anymore, so I'm not sure I have great practical answers. I just try to publish what I published and always talk about it. I know some of my other panelists will have thoughts on concrete. I see Kate just unmuted.
Sure. As I said, I'm a literature scholar. And so from my perspective, there's a lot that people in my position can do, because I'm in a position that was historically the ones that were doing bibliography. They were the bibliographers. They were in literature departments primarily. And so the dynamic in the period that I've been looking at of the mid-20th century was the male scholar primarily going to an archive in which largely women worked, using the materials of that archive, and then not citing a single librarian or cataloger ever. And while the gender dynamics of many of this interaction has changed, citational practices haven't changed. The valuing of librarianship by literary scholars hasn't changed. Not once in my training did somebody mention that librarianship was a whole field and they do things, and it's not just this like transparent repository for books where you get things and then you cite thing and pretend repository don't exist except for citations. We've set up this power dynamic in literature especially, and I'm only going to speak for my field here, although I think it could be applied more widely. And part of what I can do is write legitimacy for my colleagues' labors back into my work, that this is a collaborative process. This isn't single authored. I need to be, the Caswell test, like make sure you're citing an archivist, not archival theory. These are things that I feel like I can do. And so if you're in a position similar to me, maybe those would work for you.
Certainly this kind of thing happens in history as well. Historians tend to really take advantage of archivists or take archival work for granted. There's the whole trope of discovering something in the archives that you only discovered because it's already been cataloged by an archivist. But also I think what has changed things for historians is the understanding of the things that are not in the archive, because they were written by women, or they were written by Black people, or they were destroyed because they came, from an Aboriginal society, whatever it might be. So that was part of why I was saying we have to be ambitious about, even so ambitious as to say the sources are not there, but we need to do it anyway. We need to figure out some way to get hold of it by finding some other kind of sources to work with, or working with theory, or whatever it is that we do. And that's different in every discipline. It struck me that thinking about what book feminisms is totally different for a feminist librarian than it is even for a feminist professor, and different again for a feminist book dealer. But there is these places where we can all speak the same language for a few minutes.
Tamar, go ahead.
I'm from the field of librarianship. I just want to say, I think we have this belief that because librarianship is feminized, that there are no issues, and that it's not a space where we feel marginalized, and we have to try to identify how we use our female voice to create change and power. And I always have questions about what are the debates around gender that played out in print culture, and the women that I showcased, I never got to say, you know, at the end I was getting there, even though they were very powerful and they were great at curating these amazing collections. I'm just going to take Bella, the Cost of Green. It was always kind of this obsession with her clothes and who did she sleep with, J.P. Morgan, what was she wearing, as well as Vivian Harsh, that kind of in collective memory, we didn't get to learn about what their curatorial process, you know, what was in that way. And how can we do this better? I just think we need a real commitment that requires us to take on greater investment and risk, and just willingness to interrogate our own practices, because we have to start there. And just don't package our action into seminars like this or podcasts or events. I think we need to find some way to be sustainable with this. And I was saying to Sarah, you know, I asked, how are we documenting the work that we're doing in a way that it's going to be represented honestly years and years from now?
So we have lots of great questions, including one request for the citation of Jesse Erickson's work mentioning tattoos. So I'll try and crowdsource that. If anyone has a link and can put that in the chat, that would be great. This question has had a lot of upvotes. So can anyone provide any recommendations with a closed historical collection, very representative of an ideal gentleman's library, consciously with a feminist practice?
So something I'll say is I work with Kirsten Luner and Deborah Hollis on the Stainforth Library of Women's Writing, which is somewhat similar. It's in the Boulder Library, so it's no longer a closed library, but he collected women's writing in the 18th and 19th centuries up until he died. So it is a male collector. He is a gentleman. There's a lot of similarities, and there's an obvious feminist focus for us because he collected women's writing. But part of what we have ran into as we approach this library and approach this study is that usually the labor, like this is what Mackenzie really taught us with sociology of the text, is usually the labor is much more broad than the guy who collected it. Like there could have been dealers who he was buying for, book owners he was buying for who were women. Women could have marks of ownership in the books. Women could have read the books. There's a lot of different ways that people touch and live around books that are not just owning them. And so one way of applying feminist practice is by acknowledging that the great book collector had probably 4 people making his food and cleaning his bed, and all of that labor is just as valuable as the library and the house and the space.
And I would also, so this is really hard to do, and it's a project that I'm really struggling with, but I'm really insistent on there's got to be a way that we can look at the physical manifestations of books. So again, like really what I'm interested in are printed artifacts. I'm not really interested in the words that they say or the people who printed them. I really do think that there can be a feminist practice of working with those books. And part of it where I've been sort of like trying this out so far comes back from something that Leslie said in her piece from 20 years ago, which is to think about the sort of like the gendered lives that books inhabit, and to think about collecting practices. And I really do think that this sort of trying to forefront our expectations of what we are conditioned to imagine a rare book looks like. So that a gentleman's library is going to be clean, it's going to have uniform bindings. Like, I'm not saying these things are true. I'm saying these are sort of our cultural conditionings for how we imagine when looking at that. Bringing fresh eyes to that, to constantly ask, why are these books in this condition in this library? So that it's not just about the actual text, but it's like, why is it that it's this manifestation of this text that's in this library. And they're like, oh, because that's the one that's really nicely bleached. Or that could not be the answer. It could be like, well, it turns out this guy didn't have any money, and so all of his copies are the messed up ones because that's what he could afford. I think that's also a sort of can be a feminist practice of working with a gentleman's library.
Well, and we're wrapping up here. It's 5:01, so I'm, as the moderator, going to have maybe take the last word, which is that I also think that, you know, as someone who, for example, spent a good chunk of their career working in a subscription library founded in the 18th century, a lot of the money that was used to purchase books that are still surviving in that collection was built off of the slave trade. And I think that we also need to acknowledge something that Curtis Small said in an event yesterday. What day is it? I don't know. Very recently, about anti-racist book work, is that we need to do this in an intersectional way, and not just acknowledging that there are feminist readers, but that, you know, the entire body of many libraries we work in and work with are either physically built by, in the case of UVA, UVA's very, very sort of difficult past, and you know, how do we reckon with this? And I think that particularly as white scholars, for those of us who are white, and women scholars, that we need to also recognize those pasts along with the women who are on the other side of that, cataloging and doing all that work. So thank you all so very much for what has been just a wonderful session today. I think this has been one of the best events we've had all year. And Tamar, I don't know if you want to add any closing words too, as a Cornell person. Please do, take it away.
Oh, thank you very much. I just want to say, I think, you know, I speak to Brenda as well as all, you know, people from Cornell, that we're so glad to be a part of this. I think we're very committed to this work. I know I am, I know Brenda is, and we want to continue to make this sustainable. So please take us up that challenge to kind of brainstorm about where we can go from here. And also, how are we going to create the next generation of feminists in this work?
What a wonderful note to end on. Thank you all so much. I hope to see you again, and take care, be safe, be well. Bye, everyone.